Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Person You Want to Be. I am your host, Eric Teplitz. Today, I am honored to have back on the podcast one of my favorite contemporary thinkers whose work has had and continues to have a profound influence on my own life, Eric Maisel. Eric Maisel is the author of literally more than 50 published books, including Coaching the Artist Within, Rethinking Depression, Life Purpose Bootcamp, and Lighting the Way, to name just a few of my own personal favorites. Dr. Maisel, a retired family therapist, pioneered the field of coaching creative and performing artists. He remains an active creativity coach today, trains creativity coaches, facilitates writing workshops all over the world, and has created a brand new training program for existential wellness coaches. This program captures the ideas that are the sum and substance of his life's work, helping people to make the most of what he calls their available personality, which we will get into in greater depth in our conversation today. Without further ado, I am very grateful and excited to now get to say, Eric Maisel, welcome back to The Person You Want to Be.
Great to be here, Eric. Lovely to be here.
So, what I tend to do on this show usually is I interview people about their own life journeys and their own stories and those inflection points in their lives so that I can glean insights into how my guest has determined who it was or who it is they want to be in the world throughout their life's journey. It changes, obviously, as time goes on. And we did that in our last conversation, which, by the way, was episode 2 of this podcast, Early Days. I will put a link to that in the show notes for those that would like to explore that. But this time around, I thought that since so much of your work really addresses this question of how do we become the person we want to be, I thought that a good way to frame this conversation would be to start by discussing the challenges involved here. It sounds innocent enough, becoming who we want to be, but I thought we would take a moment to discuss in some detail exactly what we're up against so we have a clearer sense of the so-called enemy, as it were, or at least
Mhm.
what we're up against, the challenges that people face. They're going to be unique, obviously, to each individual, but as a point of entry, I thought what I would do is mention a post that you wrote, and it's on Psychology Today. It was published on October 28th, 2021, on your Rethinking Mental Health blog. And it's called The Sixth Model of Personality. And in that post, really, you describe sort of some of the more universal obstacles or challenges that we face in becoming who it is we want to be. And just to refresh your memory, the first one of those is this notion that is pretty prevalent that we, especially nowadays, with I think what I'm sensing is a resurgence in this determinism versus free will question, long
Mhm.
philosophical debate. And there have been some compelling arguments of late for determinism and how everything, in fact, is predetermined, which limits the sense that we have of our own agency. And so one of the in your 6 models of personality, the first one that you describe is this concept that we are our biology. And I'd love to just hear you take a moment to speak to what is meant by that argument.
Nice big subject. Um, for folks listening and watching, one of my areas of interest actually has 3 names. It's called critical psychology, critical psychiatry, or sometimes anti-psychiatry. And it's the point of view that the current mental disorder model, promulgated essentially by the American Psychiatric Association, but of course it's a worldwide model now. Here, our Diagnosing and Treating Guide is the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. Worldwide, it's the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. Both do the following thing. They translate or transpose all of the behaviors that we display and all of the thoughts that we have and turn them into checklist symptoms of mental disorders. So somehow it becomes a symptom of a mental disorder if you hate your job or are unhappy in your marriage or what have you. Somehow those get translated into symptoms of a mental disorder, leading to a chemical solution, a chemical answer. That's the biological model. The biological model is that we are our biology, sometimes called the biopsychosocial model, just so everything gets included, so nothing gets left out. It's a meaningless phrase, but everything is biopsychological, social, everything is that. But that's the way language works, and so there's some cachet around that language. So the biological model makes believe that some brain scan is going to be an answer to the question why we're existentially sad. And it's one of the reasons that cognitive psychology, all pseudoscience-based things are so popular right now, because the biological model has taken hold, and it's the prevalent model. It's the paradigm. It used to be the paradigm that we were our thoughts, that with the psychological model was more the paradigm from, let's say, the 1890s to the 1950s. The 1950s is when the first DSM came out. So for that period, 75 years, the psychological model held sway, and that had different meanings. If you were a Freudian, it meant one thing. If you were a Jungian, it meant another thing. If you were an Adlerian, it meant something else. But it came back around to we are what we think, which is what Epictetus said thousands of years ago. We are what we think. The Buddha jumped on that bandwagon and said, get a grip on your mind. In the UK, the main therapy remains cognitive behavioral therapy, still the idea that we are what we think. So that has its lane still. Psychology still has its lane, but psychiatry has won that competition by virtue of people wanting a mental disorder label. Unfortunately, people want it. They want it for their kids. They want something to be understandable at that simple level. Something's going on that has a biological component, and therefore, if we find the right chemical response, that'll take care of the issue. I don't think anybody really believes that, but they're hanging their hat on that possibility. So to say that simply, the biological model is an anti-free will model that argues that we're a certain kind of machinery that can break, and that essentially the answer to what's going on in life is better plumbing.
Hmm. So let me ask you, do you think that there is a place for prescription medicine in people's suffering, in their psychological suffering, let's say?
Super complicated issue, but I'll give you a headline response. The short answer is it would be lovely if the answer could be no. That would be lovely. The answer can't quite be no, because if someone's at an existential or psychological or human extremity, if you're on a bridge contemplating suicide, and an antidepressant could get you off that bridge and open a door or a window so that you had the opportunity to live another day and rethink whether you want to commit suicide, well, that's a place for antidepressants. And if you're having a huge audition that makes the difference between you being a symphony cellist or not, maybe an anxiety medication is useful there. So there are exceptions. I would like to say that the rule is please try to stay away from chemicals if possible, because they aren't a real answer, comma, but there are circumstances where chemicals have their place, and I want to acknowledge and honor that.
Yeah, great. That's a great answer, and I appreciate that. I noticed just in reviewing some of your earlier writings, I went back and looked at the Van Gogh Blues, which to me seems like a predecessor to Rethinking Depression in a lot of ways. But it came out 10 years earlier, and it felt to me like you really had a great shift in your thinking about the the viability of chemicals as a way of people dealing with great, mental or psychological distress. So it sounds like you have, it sounds like now you've arrived at a place where you do see that it has its place, but you would like to see it not be so upfront and center and the sort of the go-to method for dealing with such distress. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. And its place, to my mind, is minimal. I don't want to give a percentage, but if I had to give a percentage, I think it's 1% and not
Wow.
22% or 37%.
Right.
That is, I think it's for extreme cases, in extreme reasons,
Yeah.
including self-harm, suicidality, etc. We could name the big reasons, but there are better routes for circumstances that aren't so dramatically difficult. And it's especially the case that it's a horror story for kids nowadays. And they can't decide which chemicals they're going to be given. Many kids are on multiple psychiatric medications. One of these days, one in two kids or one in three kids is going to have an ADHD diagnosis or a pediatric depression diagnosis or oppositional defiant disorder. One of those things. Every kid's going to have that, and they seem to want it. They seem to brag about their diagnoses. They like the idea of accommodations, that they get a little more time to do their tests by virtue of having a mental disorder. It's a very difficult and tricky time. And that's a place where kids really should not be receiving so many chemicals. There are gateway chemicals to lifelong addiction.
Hmm.
We have an addiction epidemic in air quotes. Well, we have an addiction epidemic. Where's that coming from? In part by virtue of giving kids all of these chemicals that are gateway drugs to addictions. So if I'm going to if I'm going to vote, the vote is for no chemicals if possible, and to use chemicals super sparingly.
Right. Got it. So you just covered, you know, really the first couple of models of personality that you write about in your article, the idea that we are our biology and the idea that we are primarily psychological creatures. We are our thoughts. Now, number three on your list of um, is this idea that we are our this thing called personality that and obviously it's a complex thing, personality. So, and I would love to hear you speak about, we touched on this the last time, your model of looking at personality, your three-pronged model. And
Sure.
I'll let you take that.
So there's typically an undergraduate or graduate level class called theories of personality in psychology and counseling programs. And gosh knows those aren't theories. That Jung had certain opinions or that Freud had certain opinions doesn't make them theories, yet they're called theories of personality. The fact that they're not theories is there was a philosopher of science called Karl Poppers who introduced the idea of falsifiability. That is, if nothing can falsify your theory, it ain't a theory.
Hmm.
If there's no way to disprove it, then something else is going on. And none of them are falsifiable. They're so flexible that anything you bring up, the so to speak theory has a way of manipulating that information and including it into the framework. So there have been all of these theories of personality. On the American front, we like the idea of personality traits, the idea of atoms growing into molecules. That is, people are made up of traits. In European psychiatry and psychology, the theoretical models have been typically Freudian mainly, and then Jungian, different views of the unconscious, lots of ideas and lots of things we could talk about. Virtually none of them start with the premise that we come into the world already somebody, which sounds sort of crazy on the face of it. How can a theory of personality not understand that human beings have blueprints in them, programs in them, proclivities in them, that were already, anybody who's had kittens or puppies or kids knows
Mhm.
that each creature comes into the world completely himself or herself or itself. We all know that. Psychology ignores that. So that's big news. We should treat every, so to speak, psychological theory with suspicion just by virtue of the fact that it has nothing to say about what I call original personality. It has nothing to say about it. And by virtue of ignoring it, it has nothing to say about a person coming into the world more sensitive than the next person, or smarter than the next person, or sadder than the next person. And by virtue of it having nothing to say about those things, whatever it says next is smaller than what could have been said. Just naturally follows that a theory of personality that doesn't take into account original personality just can't be very true. It can't be true to life because we come into the world already somebody with all kinds of temperaments and proclivities and talents and all kinds of stuff. So in my model, that's 1/3 of the model, the idea of original personality. And part of that thinking is that therefore we're always going to be faced with some unknowableness about our personality because we can't know about original personality. Because even if we talk to Uncle Jake about who we were at 3 or 2, that's already not our original personality. That's already us formed from 2 years of living.
Mm.
And if we're now a little shy or a little something, we don't know if that's our original personality or we're living in a noisy household where we're scared and therefore we're quiet. We already don't know that. So there's a big not knowing, a big mystery at the center of personality for each of us, which hopefully we can get easier with the fear that we can't know ourselves. We can't know ourselves to the extent we would like to know ourselves. So there's original personality. The second part of the model is what I call formed personality. And I use that language to help people understand better how sticky we get over time, how impossible it becomes to change over time, or how difficult it becomes to change over time by virtue of our repetitive behaviors, our repetitive thinking. We just stiffen into that recognizable Bob or that recognizable Mary. We just know what Mary's going to say, so to speak. We know what Bob's going to do, so to speak, in given circumstances. We may not know it perfectly, and they may once in a while surprise us, but basically they are who they are at this point, comma. But fortunately, and I believe this is true, the third part of the model is what I call available personality, which is our remaining freedom to be the person we would like to be. And for me, the clearest example of the truth of this availability, and I believe this is available for all of us, the clearest truth of the availability is the idea of recovery from an addiction, which is kind of amazing if you think about it. On Wednesday, we're drinking alcoholically. We run our car into a tree, we survive. On Thursday, we go to our first AA meeting and we enter early recovery. It's amazing that human beings can do that. If you were to just think about formed personality, you would think that that's not really available, that we're too stiff to ever enter recovery, that we're never going to give up that alcohol, but millions of people do. So I think that that's a testament to the idea of available personality existing as an idea. And to my mind, it's a quantity. Yeah,
Mm.
it's just a metaphor or an analogy, but to my mind, it's a quantity where we have more or less available personality depending on where we are in life. If we're currently addicted and running around town looking for a fix, we don't have that much available personality available. We're stuck. But the day we enter recovery, we have more available personality available. Now, of course, in early recovery, every person in early recovery is advised not to think they have too much personality available. They've still got to do first things first and one day at a time and take it easy and not be too ambitious and look out for triggers, the whole thing, because we understand that that available personality is not now 75% or 90%. It's still just a smaller percentage of the whole. So just to say that simply, that's the model of personality that I've been describing over time, the idea of original personality, how we come into the world, form personality, the ways we stiffen into our recognizable self, and available personality, the truth of freedom.
Wow, I love that phrase, the way you phrased that, the truth of freedom. You are clearly on the side of free will, but you're also very acknowledging of the challenges um, that we all face in having access to it. And I love that term, available personality. How much of it left is available to us to you know uh, for to make room for our will and our to have our say. And just to finish out this sixth model idea from your article. So you already covered, biology, you already covered psychology, and then the fourth one, well, third is personality, and then the fourth one is this social component, the biopsychosocial, which you covered at the, in one fell swoop at the
Yeah, and
beginning.
let me just quickly.
Mhm.
U.S. psychiatry again ignores it. It says that it's dealing with a biopsychosocial model, but then it leaves social completely out of it. It's an individualistic model where you come in and you say what's going on, and things get checked off. It's all individual stuff. And if enough things are checked off, then you get a, so to speak, diagnosis. But nothing about your social situation is relevant in that picture, which is crazy. If you
Mm.
grew up in a cult, that's irrelevant. If you're in a strictly believing household and you don't believe, that's irrelevant. If you're a refugee, that's irrelevant to how you're experiencing life, etc. How can your situation, your circumstances, your social connections, all of that not matter in terms of your emotional well-being? Makes no sense. By contrast, the British Psychological Society, and especially the clinical division of the British Psychological Society, goes way to the other end of the spectrum and makes the claim that all distress is social, that everything that goes wrong with us has either a complete social component or a major social component. And they point to statistics about the large numbers of schizophrenia diagnoses in poor neighborhoods, etc. Make relationship between circumstances and emotional distress, all of which I believe. I think there may be an overstatement there,
Mm.
but still, at least they're taking into account social concomitants of behavior. So that's just in a nutshell my view, namely, we've got to take your circumstances into account, including things as small as you're a 7-year old, you've had your room your whole life, and now there's a new baby in the house who comes into your room and you start wetting your bed. You think there's no relationship between that boy wetting his bed and the new baby entering his room? You think it's a mental disorder that suddenly he's wetting his bed? It's nutty to think that that intrusion of another person into his room would have no consequences. It's just not, but that's not how we in America think about things. We're not interested in that information about that newborn entering that child's bedroom. We're not interested in information. We're just looking at symptoms like bedwetting and going to some
Mm.
kind of diagnosis.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, and you covered really pieces 4 and 5, the social component and then the circumstantial component just then. And what's really interesting to me is that it's so obvious why you can make a compelling case for any of these ideas because they are all to some extent puppeteering us, our biology, our psychology,
That's right.
our social environment, our circumstances, and our personality, wherever that comes from. So this idea of available personality, I think, is so key and so essential. And I like the way that you put it in the article, where you say and you were talking about a human brain, obviously, a brain's true brilliance is its ability to chat with itself. And you mentioned this as your sixth view, your view, that we are, quote, dynamic, self-regulating organisms that, to put it colloquially, can chat with ourselves and aim ourselves in one direction versus another, unquote. And you mentioned as your primary go-to example of our agency and our ability to chat with ourselves and aim ourselves in a direction. You mentioned this idea that people can go into recovery. Are there any other examples that come to mind that, to make this argument for the available
Well, there are lots
personality?
of different ways to articulate this or think about this. One is the idea of unitary intelligence, an IQ number, of course, went out of favor some decades ago. There are lots of complaints about the model. And in that void or vacuum that followed, Howard Gardner brought up the idea of multiple intelligences and named many of them musical intelligence, math intelligence, etc. And left out what has to be the coordinating intelligence, because how do you know to make use of your musical intelligence or your math intelligence if there isn't a coordinating intelligence, that is existential intelligence, going on there? So to my mind, that's a kind of proof that there must be this apparatus going on in us, because us, something must be stepping to the side and saying, well, I don't think I can work on my symphony today because my kids are starving and I have to go do manual labor. Something has to be having that conversation, or else we would just be writing our symphony because we're musically intelligent, or solving a math problem because we're mathematically intelligent. We'd just be doing that if we were not having some conversation with ourselves about what's the next right thing to do, or what's any right thing to do. So I
Hmm.
think that's another kind of understanding of why that has to be the case, that we have available to us this kind of conversational ability to chat with ourselves about what's going on. One of the little exercises or tactics or strategies that I propose to clients is just the simple idea of taking a step to the side. It's a very simple idea, and,
Hmm.
and it's visually easy to understand. You're plowing through life. And one of the reasons we have the experience of there being no coordinating intelligence is that we're not stepping to the side, even though that's available to us, but we're not doing it. Because we're checking things off our checklist. We're having whatever it is, 40,000 thoughts a day. I think that's the number. So we're thinking things,
Most of them the same as yesterday, right? Isn't that
many, many, many.
yeah.
So we're thinking things and doing things and worrying about things and being anxious about, we're doing all of that. So we don't have the habit of slowing down and taking that step to the side, not necessarily every few seconds, a step to the side, but when it's important to. When something comes up that's important to, if we're about to avoid doing something really important because we're defensive creatures, Freud was right about that. We have a ton of interesting defenses that we use to not know things about
Hmm.
ourselves. So if we're about to do that, if we're about to not call a literary agent we really ought to call because we've just made a wonderful connection, because we don't exactly know what to say, so we don't make that call, so we eat candy instead. If that's where we are, that's a step to the side moment. Where if you've gotten that habit, that understanding, that demand, that self-demand, that I know I'm a defensive creature and I can feel one of those defensive moments coming, or I'm about to marginally sabotage myself. I'm going to step to the side. I'm going to breathe. I'm going to step to the side. I'm going to do all these things that all the self-help books tell me to do. And I'm going to think about my next move. I'm not going to just operate from form personality. I'm not just going to have a knee-jerk reflection here. I'm going to actually think about things. And as obvious as that sounds, as the way we ought to be, so few people actually pull it off.
Yeah, it's difficult. So there's a lot I'd love to respond to in that. And, I wanted to you basically are speaking about how we can improve our available personality, right?
Correct.
Um, and you mentioned the word more several times in what you just said, habit, that we need to make a habit of it. Like you said, not we don't necessarily need to do it every 3 seconds, but we need to habitually come back to this idea of when it's important, taking a step to the side and using that executive function that you described, that
Exactly.
coordinator part of us. Do you believe, by the way, that's located in our prefrontal cortex?
I
Yeah.
don't have that kind of thinking
Yeah.
as to where things are in the brain like that. And in other cultures, there are different ideas about where thinking occurs. It's not up there. So
Mm-hmm.
it's an interesting subject, but I don't have any particular feelings about that.
Yeah. Are there any other things that come to mind in general? Because obviously each of us is unique and we have our own particular challenges and habits, right? Ingrained habits and
Well,
defense
let
and
me,
defenses.
I can piggyback on that. And
Yeah.
that is because we are talking about habit building, we are. I believe in the idea of daily practice. I believe in that idea. I've done a book called The Power of Daily Practice. And that notion or my interest in that comes from my understanding that with my clients, my creative and performing artist clients, if they skip 3 or 4 days of working on their novel, 2 years will vanish. It's not that the 2 or 3 days matter. You may be living another one of your life purposes, and so it's completely appropriate to not work on your novel for those 2 or 3 days. That may be completely appropriate, except this huge danger. And the danger is that when we lose contact with these things that we know are important, but that are real work, like writing our novel, the second we lose 2 or 3 days, that gives us the opportunity to drop that off the stove entirely, and then years go by. And people really disappoint themselves by virtue of how much time they lose or waste when this happens. They really disappoint themselves. So I really believe in, well, I'm going to string a couple of ideas together. One is it's important that we identify our life purposes and leave the idea of a singular life purpose behind as a paradigm. Time to leave that behind. Many things are important to us. There isn't one thing that's important to us. Many things are. So if you can, you identify your life purposes, however you would want to do that. And you turn that into some kind of list or understanding of what your 3 or 4 or 5 top life purposes are of the moment. And then you get those life purposes onto your daily to-do list, as opposed to your daily to-do list always being about errands and chores and tasks and responsibilities and that other stuff. Most people are not living their life purposes because A, they haven't identified them, but B, they haven't actually introduced them onto their daily to-do list. So if you can do this thing that I'm saying, that means that now you, in a daily way, are attending to the 3 or 4 or 5 things that are actually important to you. And that they could be simple things. Maybe health is important, so that means you exercise daily. Maybe your novel is important, so you write daily. Maybe your relationship is important, so you remember to call your daughter at college every day or whatever. Whatever it is, these are not super complicated things, but by virtue of doing them every day, you actually do them. You actually attend to your life purposes, and that gives you the feeling that you're attending to your life purposes, makes you proud. And that creates more juice, more motivational energy to keep making yourself proud. So I'm saying many things quickly, but I think it has a certain clear linearity where you understand what's important to you, and then you actually connect up what's important to you to dailiness, to the idea of this is the day in front of me. I've got to sync 17 calendars. It's not about syncing 17 calendars. It's about this is the day I have. And if for only 2 or 3 hours today I can get to the important things, that's still better than not getting to the important things at all.
A lot better. And especially that if you make that a daily practice, 2 to 3 hours a day really amounts to quite a lot.
It does. And just parenthetically, not that this is shareable at the moment, but right at the moment, I'm working on a life organization app that helps people, that will help people do exactly the thing we're talking about, identify life purposes, get them located into every day, etc.
Yeah, and what I hear from how you just described that is this idea of two things. Number one, making your life purposes conscious, because someone might argue, well, of course I'm going to, call my daughter every day because I don't have to write that down somewhere. It's obviously important to me. But this idea of being conscious about it is, I think, really important. And then the second component that I heard in what you said is this idea of vigilance. It's sort of like you're saying, I am aware, I don't trust that I am fully aware of all of the things that can derail me, that can take me away from the things that I know are important to me. And with that awareness, with that acknowledgement of all of the demands, both externally that are made of us and internally, that by being deliberate and being conscious of, and declaring these are the things that are most important to me, and I must attend to at least one or two of them each day, depending on what your life looks like.
Yep.
And it really requires vigilance big time, because as you say, you miss 2 days and suddenly a year goes by and you haven't, attended to something, because it's so easy to be pulled away.
Yeah, so let's add a few layers onto this. Why wouldn't you do this? Everyone would agree, I think, at some level, this is the way to live a life that is attending to the important things. So why wouldn't you? A, as postmodern folks, we don't think that we matter or that our efforts matter. So why bother doing the important things? Because they're not really important. I'm just saying they're important. They're not really important. Universe doesn't care if I get to this or that. So who cares? So we have to care. We have to announce that we are the meaning makers in our life. But we have to address our own intentionality and recommit to mattering. So that's A.
That's a huge point, by the way.
Huge point. We have to recommit to mattering. That's A. B, our real work makes us anxious almost always because that's where we may be scrutinized or where we may be criticized or we may be putting stuff out into the world or we may judge ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. When things matter, they make us anxious. Very simple sentence, but got to get that in your head. When things matter, they make us anxious. We may, in our day job, maybe we deal with $30 million budget of our company and don't care. Yeah, throw it here, throw it there. Who
Other
cares?
people's money.
Other people's money. But then when it comes to the right word for the last line of our poem, there we start sweating, but that's the creature we are. When you get that picture, if I could spend $30 million, who cares? But that word, when we get that picture, then we understand how anxiety threads through our life, which means we need anxiety management strategies that both work and are portable. And the portability is important because you may have a beautiful meditation practice where you stay calm for 45 minutes in the morning, but if that calmness doesn't work when you're faced with trying to work on your novel or what have you, then you don't have a strategy in place that actually works for you. So we need the remattering. We need some anxiety management strategies that work and an understanding that anxiety is going to thread through the process. We want to just understand that and not be surprised each time we get a little confused or nauseous or this or that over something we're intending to do. So that's
Yeah.
B. C is the background existential coloring of despair that all of us are experiencing
Hmm.
with difficulties in the world. We don't have to name all the places for where this existential despair resides or why it confronts us, but it does. So we have to understand that it's hard to get to the things we claim are important when we're sad. Sad is dismotivating. Sad does not motivate us. So we have to find our ways of doing the things we intend to do while perhaps sad.
Hmm.
And that's a mouthful because it's not that easy to do the things we intend to do while sad. And you can pop an antidepressant that may or may not work. It certainly maybe has a placebo effect. We understand that antidepressants have about a 50% placebo effect, which is a real effect in the sense that you might feel better by virtue of having taken a sugar pill, but that's not really the effect, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't have a simple answer to sadness. We don't have a simple answer, but that's C, that may be the background coloration, and we're not motivated to do our work because we're in mild despair about life. D is a little complicated to say in a couple of words, but let me give it a shot. One of my views is that there's no meaning out there. Meaning is not an objective thing, but that it's a subjective psychological experience, or to say it more simply, it's a feeling. That meaning is a feeling and as such comes and goes, like all feelings. That's big news. People think that When life feels meaningful, that's a big event. Nope. I mean, when life feels meaningless, that's a big event. It's not a big event. Meaning just left for a while.
But it hurts, right?
Well, it hurts if you think it ought to be there.
Mm.
It stops hurting. It stops hurting completely if you can create the following sentence and live it. I don't care about meaning. I'm living my life purposes. If a human being can create that sentence, they're kind of done with meaning being a problem.
It's a big
If
if, but yeah.
big if, but if they can't. But what it means is people expect that the things that are important to them ought to feel meaningful as they do them. And very often they will not feel meaningful. They'll just feel sloggy. If, let's say, I'm an activist and my job today is to send out 100,000 emails to political contributors, I know why I'm doing that. I understand that that's one of my life purposes, to stand behind this cause, whatever the cause is. But I may be bored all day long and not acquiring the experience of meaning for 1 second on that day, which is going to make me, if I'm not careful, not want to do it on the next day. Because what I'm going to say to myself was, that didn't feel meaningful. Why the heck didn't that feel meaningful? I claim this is one of my most important things and it didn't feel meaningful. Stop needing things to feel meaningful. It's like stop needing things to feel joyful or ecstatic or any other feeling thing. We have to let go of that desire dash guarantee that we're wanting, that a thing that we do feel meaningful, and just announce to ourselves, I'm living my life purposes, and that's plenty.
Hmm. And if we flip that, anxiety also is a subjective experience. It's a feeling. I mean, there are biochemical components to it, but it
Absolutely.
like just like with meaning, it comes and goes. And I think that this relationship like we have with anxiety, obviously, when we're overwhelmed by anxiety, we can't function. We don't have much of our personality available to us, as you would say.
Exactly right.
So we have to manage it. Um, but what I find is a helpful trick is that sometimes when I'm feeling anxious, to me, I try to use that as a reminder. I'm feeling anxious because something's important to me. And that can be a way of, I suppose, you know, stepping to the side and saying, this isn't a bad thing. I shouldn't expect to never feel anxious when I'm, you know, in fact, I should take it as a sign that something matters to me. And that's good that
Right.
something matters to me.
Right. And another way to say that, or a different way to say that, is anxiety is a feature of our early warning system against danger. And so we want it because we want to know not to go down that dark alley or not get into that elevator if it's feeling dangerous. We want to feel anxious in those moments so that we don't get into that elevator or whatever. So as our early warning system against danger, we want it. But then we get to ask ourselves when we're feeling anxious, what's the danger?
Hmm.
It's just a smart cognitive question, smart question to ask ourselves. What exactly is the danger? And if we're lucky enough to have the patience to actually try to answer that question, we may understand. I'll give you an example. I work with lots of memoirists who never get their memoirs written. It's been 10, 12, 14, 16 years, quote, working on their memoir, which of course means they're never working on it. It doesn't mean they're working on it. They're not working on it for all that whole period of time. And they don't quite realize that every time they try to approach it, they get anxious. And therefore, the number one thing we do when we're anxious is flee the encounter. That's the number one thing we do. We go the other direction. So they're moving towards their computer and they end up in the kitchen or the garden or some other place.
With a
They
very
change,
clean house.
very clean house. They change direction. But if they could ask themselves, what's the danger? They could perhaps get close to understanding that they're not working on their memoir because they are actually worried about what their mother's going to say if their mother ever read the memoir. That even though they've intellectually, on the top of their head, they've said to themselves, I don't care what anybody thinks about what I'm writing. I'm putting it out there. I'm putting it right out there. I don't care what anybody, but somewhere else, they're actually worried about how their sister and their brother and their mother and their father are going to react to this thing there. So that's all by way of saying, if one could do this thing that we're talking about, that is understand that you're feeling anxious. It's not that easy to acknowledge that. Plus, these symptoms of anxiety can be weird, like mental
Mm,
confusion. You may not, if you're feeling dull or something, you may not know that that's an anxiety symptom. So we need to A, figure out what our own anxiety profile looks like, what our symptoms look like, and then B, have this conversation with ourselves about, okay, something's feeling dangerous. What actually is it? And that might lead to some really big realization that, wow, so what seems to be dangerous is X, and my gosh, that's not dangerous at all. Or if it is feeling dangerous, that maybe then there's a circumstance to change. Let me say that another way. Let's say that we're not getting to writing our novel because our husband has retired and we're worried that he's going to walk in on us and break our concentration and tell us about his golf game, and it's going to drive us nuts. But we've never said that sentence out loud. So we're sitting there in our study with our door closed, with hearing our husband rumbling around the kitchen, not writing. But we don't know why we're not writing. We don't know it's directly
mm.
related to him wandering around the kitchen. We don't get that till we get that. We don't get that insight until we get that insight. But having gotten that insight, that isn't the complete answer. We'd have to take some action, which is put a sign on our door, not available, or tell him, please don't get up so early, or please go out to golf earlier so you're out of the something. We may have to speak. That is, and that makes us anxious.
Right.
The
But
understanding that we may have to take some action in support of reducing our anxiety may make us anxious.
yeah, but what I love about that is the deliberateness of it. It's again, the recognition once as you say, once we're aware of what's causing a particular anxious moment, the acknowledgement of it, and then the sort of problem solving element of it, the accepting that this is going to continue to happen unless I change something environmentally
That's right.
or yeah.
And let's go down the other road, which is you notice you're anxious, but you don't know why. You can't
Mm,
identify the source of the anxiety. Well, then you need your tactics for dealing with unidentified anxiety because you still want to deal with it. And maybe it's something as simple as a certain kind of breathing exercise or some mantra you say to yourself or whatever it is, or just getting up and moving because movement helps with anxiety if the anxiety is rooted in what's called inhibited flight. If we're feeling trapped, like in an airplane,
mm.
in the seat, just getting up and walking down the aisle can help. That just breaks that inhibited flight feeling. So at any rate, there are simple things like getting up and walking around that reduce anxiety. We want that menu for ourselves. We want to know I could do a little breathing. I could do a little right thinking. I could do a little movement. I could do a little this, a little that, and that might help. And it will help, actually.
Yeah, and I think that what's really helpful is when you actually succeed at this, you're maybe not going to succeed every single time, but if you've had an experience of being anxious and finding some way to quell it, some way to get past it and do the thing that you've decided is important to you, then you can then reference that. That's like a point of reference now that you have. I've done this before. And it's, it can be a very self-reinforcing behavior. And again, I think it's good to have more than one go-to solution in case one doesn't work on a particular day. But if you can build up a case for yourself based on actual points of reference from experience of having succeeded at moving through it.
And then you don't want to be overly surprised if that doesn't work.
Right.
Because the next source of anxiety may be greater than the last source of anxiety inexplicably. I'll give you an example. I had done, I don't know, I'm going to guess 100 radio interviews before I did my first television interview. So I figured, well, television interview, it's just like radio, only they see you. So what's, no big deal. But it was a completely different experience being in this huge studio with like 500 empty desks. I don't know what the desks were doing there or where the people were or anything. And when they start, threading microphones up your shirt and it's just a different environment from doing a radio interview. So I got really quite anxious in the green room, waiting for that. For me, fortunately, I had a cognitive solution which worked, which was I reminded myself that I had intended to be here. that I've done a million things in order to get here. That this had been my intention all along, and that helped me sort of normalize the situation and deal with it.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a question. We talked about becoming conscious, actually choosing your life purposes, which is the title of a forthcoming book of yours, choosing your life purposes, and then making a point of including them on your daily to-do list, however you think of that.
Mhm.
Um, but what one thing that I find really fascinating about this, and it's why I have this show called The Person You Want to Be. One thing I find really fascinating about this decision-making process of choosing who we want to be is how that can change over time as
Absolutely.
circumstances change, as we change. Um, so it's important to touch base on a regular basis
It is.
and decide, are these, my current life purposes, right? Because there
That's
could be an
exactly right.
outdated one.
And our life purposes can change on a dime. They,
Mm.
they can change instantly. I'll give you a simple example. Let's say you've identified your health as something important to you. Maybe you haven't been taking care of your health, and now you decide that you'd better. And so you start exercising and start dieting, blah, blah, blah. And then your child comes to you, your adult son comes to you and says, Dad, I need a kidney. Your positioning of health at the top of your life purposes priority list goes out the window. Now, if you're one kind of person, you're no longer thinking about your health. You're thinking about helping your son survive. And that's an earthquake shift in the way in which you're thinking about your life purposes. So that's just one kind of example, but our life purpose choices can change that radically, that quick. If our countries on day one, we're not at all interested in, let's say, patriotism or some word like that. And on day two, our country's invaded, and suddenly that's important to us. Defending our country is important to us. It wasn't on our mind the day before, and now there's nothing else on our mind.
Mm.
So that's the way things happen in real life. I'll give you another example. This isn't precisely the same example, but I think it's relevant. A while ago, I was interviewing folks about XYZ, and one of the things that I wanted to know from them was how they kept meaning afloat in their lives, or how meaning came and go in their lives. And these were people who uh, had real important professions, and they were grown-ups. They'd been around the block. But to a person, they had had the experience of the meaning draining out of some enterprise in their life, like college teaching, or for one woman, her whole belief system. She was Mother Teresa's right-hand nun, and so was important in that order, but stopped believing in God, Mother Teresa, and her order, all of those things. So these were big shifts, earthquake shifts. But now here's the but. To a person, it took them 5 years to act on their new understanding of where they were. 5 years to get that divorce, 5 years to give up tenure, 5 years to leave that order. That's a long time to be suffering, because they were suffering during that whole time, because now they were not aligned with their own sense of their life purposes. So that's all by way of saying we need to be checking in. And not only do we need to be checking in, but if we notice that a particular life purpose clearly is not relevant to us any longer, or the meaning's drained out of it, or however you want to say it, then you want to argue yourself into the understanding that some action steps are needed, that they're going to be coming sooner rather than later, that they're not avoidable, that down the road and we know this. We know that down the road that divorce is coming.
Mm.
We kind of know that someplace. We just don't want to face that now. So I would invite that person to try to begin to face that now.
Yeah. And this is why I'm such a proponent of journaling, because it's a way to keep in touch with yourself on a regular basis. And now you mentioned some earthquake shifts, but I think maybe more often than not. Those do obviously occur, but maybe more often than not, it's more subtle than that. And journaling is one way in which you can touch base with yourself on a regular basis to just be observant of those subtle shifts that might be happening.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'd love to ask you, when we're talking about non-earthquake type shifts in our life purposes
Mhm.
changing,
Yep.
one of the I think the art, the art of living well rides on a song made popular by Kenny Rogers some years ago, The Gambler,
Islands in the
and
stream. No.
the I love the chorus of The Gambler. You got to know when to hold 'em and know when to fold 'em. And that might be one of the most, I think, biggest challenges in life is when we're invested in something maybe deeply. Uh, you know, do we keep investing in it
Yeah.
or not?
Yeah, I get this question a lot from my clients who are wondering whether to abandon a particular novel or a particular subject matter for their painting or what have you. There can't be an exact answer, but I do believe that we get a tingle down the spine, that we get if we have an actual physiological understanding of when to stop, if we notice carefully, at least that's my belief, is that we get a really good body message when it's time to stop, comma, but there's a but. And the but is people abandon projects too early.
Hmm.
On balance, if you were going to ask me, do they stay with them too long or abandon them too early? They abandon them too early. So I'm a big proponent of having a complete cycle, doing the whole thing, whatever the thing is, at least once. So finish that book, and if you can't find a traditional publisher, self-publish it just so you have the experience of having readers, etc. Get through that once. You could certainly abandon it at the 15,000 word place and say that was a bad idea or it's not working or what have you. You could certainly do that, and that may be appropriate in case A. But my suggestion to most of my clients is try to get to the end of one whole cycle
Hmm.
before thinking about abandoning it, because I don't think we learn enough about process without going through the process. Process is a real thing. Process comes with, mistakes and messes and pratfalls and all kinds of stuff, including just lots of ordinary work where we're not exceptional, which we don't really want to hear from ourselves, but often we just do ordinary stuff. Maybe 90% of the work we do as a creative person is ordinary, and be lucky if 10% were exceptional. That'd be a good number, I think.
Wow.
So, so that's one of my admonitions in this question of hold them or fold them. Hold them if you can. Of course, fold them if you must, but hold them if you can.
I like that answer a lot. Thank you for that. In our last conversation, at some point, I don't remember the exact context, you referred to a Virginia Woolf quote about getting an echo from the universe. And this could be another clue, in addition to tuning into our own body, about whether something is worth pursuing or worth continuing to pursue. You talk about this idea of getting an echo from the universe. And you also, and it's coming back to me now, you mentioned, for instance, in your own life story, you began as a novelist and you spent a good decade of your life with the intention of becoming a novelist and writing, and you did, and you wrote novels, but
Yep.
you had sort of a if you'll pardon the expression, coming to Jesus moment,
Around
where
money.
yeah, money, like reality, right? So of and you felt that it was, and the term, I remember the wording you used was, you felt it was no longer a good faith move to continue that pursuit, or maybe you said
Yeah.
either good faith or bad faith. I thought that was fascinating, and that obviously that was dependent, at least in part, maybe large part, about this idea of the echo, from the universe, or the echo maybe not coming from the universe. So how do people evaluate whether their efforts are quote unquote good faith efforts or bad faith efforts? What kind of metrics do you think about in terms of assessing that?
That's quite tricky, but in the context in the context you were describing, that wasn't an echo issue. That was a what was fair to the family.
Right.
So it was that kind of issue there. It was what's the right thing to do, ethically speaking, at this moment, with small children in the house and us needing more money and no particular prospects. Had there been prospects, that would be yet a different, that would add to the puzzle. But there were no particular prospects. Certain things hadn't happened that might have happened. I'm going to just tell you just a quick anecdote. There was a moment where one of my novels came out called The Blackbirds of Malouse, a good novel. And an agent, I had self-published it, an agent came to me and said, I want to represent it. And it was a two-agent house. And at some point, the two agents split company, and I had to choose one agent. And in my estimation, I ultimately chose the wrong agent. And so the book never found a traditional publisher. That's just a bit of an anecdote about the kinds of experiences that go into a decision. So there are lots of those kinds of experiences that go into a decision to stop writing fiction, which, by the way, I resumed writing fiction over
Yeah,
the years,
right.
interspersed. But going into that moment, there's lots going on. One of which was not, oh, I'm not getting an echo, therefore I should move on. It was not, that was not the echo one for me. It was that we needed money and I didn't feel like I had prospects. So that's just to sort of clarify that moment. That's what was going on there. But with respect to speaking to the echo question, long time ago, I was dating a woman who was a poet and having no particular success. So she would read her poetry at poetry readings, and but nothing much was coming. Plus, what much could come of writing poetry? What could be the outlandish or outstanding financial goals of writing poetry? None come to mind. But so she was at a reading. We were at a reading. She read her poetry, and somebody in the audience came up to her after the reading and said, "You know, you're a real poet." And that was the vocabulary of praise that worked.
Mm.
Much of what we get from the world doesn't linguistically work. It's not enough. Well, I liked your poem. Nope, that's not going to work. Even I loved your poem may not work because there's something else going on there. Like maybe I didn't love your other poem as well. Something, but you're a real poet worked.
Mm.
So that when we talk about echo, that's the kind of thing we're wanting back from the universe, not another follower on Instagram or not this or not that. It's something that's at that high level of ratification of what we're doing and our excellence, ratification of our excellence, not just a little check mark that somebody heard something we said and enjoyed it or what have you. That's all good. We want that. But this echo thing is at a higher level of necessity.
Well, that's really well said. So I know we need to wrap this up, and I'd like to um, first ask you about, just out of my own curiosity, when we spoke last time, you mentioned that actually when you were really a young boy, which I thought was pretty unusual, you were drawn to the great existential thinkers and writers, people like Sartre, Dostoevsky,
Yeah.
Camus, and that's where you really took a lot of, I think, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's appropriate that you took a lot
Yep.
of inspiration from these writers.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And yeah, and they have informed the work that you have done, and you have talked about your intention to upgrade and update existentialism. And I want to give you room at the end, by the way, to plug your training program for existential wellness coaches, because I've been attending the webinars that have been leading up to this, and they are absolutely outstanding. I'm of the opinion, even if you have no interest in becoming a coach yourself, just in terms of, but you want to live the best life you can, these they're just full of gems. All of these webinars that you've been delivering, and I'm sure, and that make up the part, that make up this course. I'm all over the place here. My question
Mhm.
is,
Mhm.
what would you say currently are your sources of inspiration? Because obviously there's a lot of darkness in the world. You acknowledge it all the time. But what inspires you personally, and where do you draw inspiration from to currently?
Yeah, it's not any person.
Hmm.
It's not any philosophical tradition at this moment. It's actually what I'm drawing inspiration from is the possibility of scaling up. which is a new reality dash or new possibility for me. What I mean is, if I have X thousands of readers of a given book, that's lovely. But now that I'm working on this life organization app, which I think has the possibility of reaching a lot of people, or a lot of people might find it useful and might adopt it. That's what's inspiring me, is the possibility of a bigger audience, to
Mhm.
say that simply. And also, what's inspiring me, if that's the right word, or what I'm finding really interesting. So I'm completely used to writing 60,000, 70,000, 80,000 word books, completely used to that. I could do it in my sleep. What I'm finding interesting is translating 70,000 word books into 7 words as a statement in the app, or as a value proposition, as they say. That's fascinating to me, to bring bring the elephant down to whatever the metaphor is.
Mhm.
So I'm finding that to be in another world, I guess that's maybe the way to say it. To be in another world is really interesting to me, and I'm completely enjoying that. And I probably will jettison many of the things I do in the service of spending more and more time in that app world.
Hmm. Great example of evolving life purposes right there.
Exactly.
And when I ended the last interview with you last time, I asked you what was next for you, and your answer in terms of who you wanted to be next. And your answer was you wanted to do more of the same. That is, write books, deliver webinars, those sorts of things. And you had said, and something new, but you weren't quite sure what that even would be yet. And you've done a number of things since then that might qualify as the something new. You mentioned the app that is in the making, but you also started your own community, and you created this existential wellness coach training program. So I'd love to just turn the floor over to you. If I missed anything in terms of something new that since we last spoke 2 years ago, that you want to call attention to, and or any of your upcoming projects that you would like to highlight for listeners or viewers to take a look at.
Not really in the sense of I don't have multiple things to announce. I'm just alert people to the 2 new programs that I'm doing in conjunction with what's called Noble Manhattan Coaching, which is a large international coach program delivery organization. And so with them, I've created a creativity coach certificate program and an existential wellness coach certificate program. They're essentially self-paced, self-programmed learnings, but Noble Manhattan provides all kinds of support in terms of buddy systems and monthly coachings. It's a really wonderful organization that I'm going to say this slightly sideways, and that is I had sort of designated internally in my own mind 2023 as a year of collaborations, because I don't really collaborate much. I'm a solitary solo guy mostly, but I wanted to change that last year. And these new trainings amount to some wonderful new collaborations. So just to say that, simply, if just come to my site, you'll notice these 2 new programs. They may well interest you. The site is ericmaisel.com, and I don't have a lot more to say about them. That they have lots of bells and whistles that would take too long to explain. I
Mhm.
think the creativity coaching certificate program has, what's 52 times 5, 260 lessons or some number like that. So it's got a lot of richnesses in those training programs. So come take a look.
I love it. And it also speaks to this idea of scaling your work, right? Because now it's recorded for posterity and people can benefit from it ad infinitum, and they're not limited to just the live trainings that you would offer.
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, Eric Maisel, thank you once again. I really, really appreciate you making the time for this conversation, and uh, I want to, give you the equivalent compliment of you're a real poet, um, in whatever sense you want to take that in, and just in terms of your contributions to creativity, to helping people realize their potential, to mental health. I really strongly encourage people to explore your books and other offerings. I will link to the key ones in the show notes. And thanks again for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.